Today we are talking about plot. Plot, as you know, is what drives a story. It's a sequence of events that make up a story. Plot is the definition that is shown here is plot is the literary element that describes the structure of a story. It shows arrangement of events and actions within a story. Basically, without a plot, you can't have a story. In the beginning of the story, you meet the characters, you learn the background information, you figure out what the conflict is. This is called the beginning. When we were in elementary school, we called it the beginning. Now that we're in middle school, we call it the exposition. Then, see that's kind of the flat area right here in the beginning. Then the narrative hook. That is what hooks us in. Just like imagine if you're fishing and you get that fish on your thing and you have to hook it, kind of jiggle up on your line and you hook it and it's captured. That's what happens to us when we read. So this is usually something that snags our attention, that makes us want to keep reading. It also sets off the story, the rising action of the story. These are all of the events in the story leading up to the climax. Now, usually the climax comes in the middle or nearing the end of the story, depending on the length. And the climax is the turning point of the story. Continuing along our mountain, then the falling action. As you can guess, these are the events that follow the climax, that lead us to the end of our story, or, now that we're in middle school, we will call it the resolution. Here are the plot components, as I was saying, the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. You need to write these all down in your notes because you will need to know these 5 plot components. As I was saying earlier, plot is driven by a conflict. Without a conflict, without a problem, there can be no story. Conflict is the dramatic struggle between two forces in a story. Without conflict, there is no plot. We must have a conflict. Just like we have conflict in our normal lives, the problem or a struggle, conflict happens in literature. Now this should be a review. I know that you've heard of these types of things before. Character versus character. These are the different types of conflict, remember. So we have character versus character, character versus nature, character versus society, and character versus self. You'll also need to be taking notes on these 4 types as I explain them each to you. The first one we're going to talk about is character versus character. Man versus man or other person. This type of conflict, as the definition says, finds the main character, our protagonist, in a conflict with another character, human or not human. Think of Harry Potter. Our good friend Harry is at conflict with whom? Voldemort. So we might not consider him human, but it's another character, another person that Harry is fighting, and that's really where all the conflict in the story comes from. Here's another example of The Ugly Duckling, the famous childhood story. The new one is the most beautiful of all. He is so young and pretty, and the old swans bowed their heads before him. Then he felt quite ashamed and hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy and yet not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say he was the most beautiful of all the birds. As you can see here, this is an example of people, the swans versus swans, or the ugly ducks versus the ugly duckling versus the older swans. So it doesn't always have to be human, just characters in the story. The next type is character versus nature. This type of conflict finds the main character in conflict with the forces of nature, which serve as the antagonist. Protagonist, good guy. P, I always think of it, protagonist starts with P. Protagonists are positive. Antagonists. Antagonist is the evil side. So think about some of our favorite movies or books that we've read, Man versus Wild kind of things. This is when the nature, a person's trying to beat the volcano and that's going to ruin their home. These are examples of a nature conflict. Plot. Character versus society conflict. This type of conflict has the main character in conflict with a larger group. It might be the community that he or she lives in, a society, the culture, etc. Think of the Hunger Games. Katniss is in conflict with the capital. It's a bigger group. It's not just, yeah, she has little conflicts with the people that are in the arena, but her main conflict throughout is really with the capital, the society or government. From this book, The Island of the Skog, I'm tired of living in a hole, said Ginny. Let's fight for freedom, cried Bouncer. We'll be soldiers, rough-riding rowdies. Hey, there's some alliteration. I'll be the general and commander-in-chief. So, an example of trying to fight the establishment, fight the government, that's the problem there. Finally, character versus self conflict. In this type of conflict, the main character experiences some kind of inner conflict. So this is sort of a struggle between good and evil within the character. Let's look at this example. Finally, Sam's father said, "Go to bed now." But before you can go to sleep, Sam, tell yourself the difference between the real and the moonshine. So this story, if you haven't read it, is not going to be the best example. But think about an internal struggle. Even when we're thinking about Bruno right now in our book that we're reading, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, right now he's kind of having an internal struggle. He feels like he's going to go mad because he's so bored and hates it there. That's an example of internal struggle. So, I hope now you have an idea of the plot. The 5 components that we're going to talk about are, again, exposition, which is the start of the story. This is what we learn when we learn the background. Rising action, which comes next, is the series of conflicts and crises in the story that lead to the climax. Climax. This is the turning point, the most intense moment, either mentally or in action. That's when the story really changes. And falling action, all of the action which follows the climax. Resolution is the conclusion, the tying together of all the threads. And then you'll need to remember our 4 types of conflict: character versus character, character versus nature, character versus society, and character versus